If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Ghost Whispers. The gas meter impostor. I still get chills when I think about that day. It started off so normal, one of those sunny mornings where everything feels mundane in the best way possible. I was home alone with our dog Max, a big German Shepherd mix who's usually more of a lazy couch potato than a guard dog. My parents had gone out for some errands, and I was left in charge of the house. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't unusual. We'd had utility workers come by before, so I wasn't alarmed when I saw a man in a navy blue uniform standing there. He had a clipboard in one hand and what looked like an ID badge clipped to his pocket. He told me he was here to check the gas meter, which made sense because it's located in the backyard. But there was something off about him. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and he kept glancing past me into the house, like he was looking for something, or someone. Max, who usually loves meeting new people, had planted himself between me and the door, growling low in his throat. That wasn't like him at all. I told the guy to wait while I grabbed my phone, and when I came back, I saw him leaning forward, like he was trying to peer further into the house. My stomach did a little flip, but I still tried to stay polite. I opened the door just a crack, enough to slide my head and shoulder through. Max was right behind me, his growl getting louder. I asked the guy if he had any paperwork or ID I could see, and that's when his whole demeanor changed. His smile dropped, and he got defensive, saying he was in a hurry and had other houses to check. My gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right. His badge looked weird, like it had been printed at home, and the logo on his shirt didn't match the one I'd seen on our last gas bill. I told him I'd need to call the company to confirm, and he snapped, "Look, kid, I don't have all day." That's when Max went ballistic, barking, snarling, like I'd never heard before. The guy stepped back quickly, but instead of leaving, he started pacing on the porch, muttering under his breath. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it was enough to make my hands shake. I shut the door, locking it immediately, and backed away, keeping an eye on him through the peephole. He wasn't leaving. Instead, he moved to the side of the house, out of view, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed Max's collar to keep him calm, but I could feel him trembling with tension. That's when I heard it. A soft click coming from the backyard gate. The sound of the gate opening sent a jolt of panic through me. Max was going crazy, barking and lunging at the back door now. I ran to the kitchen window that overlooked the yard, and sure enough, the guy was back there. He didn't look like a utility worker anymore. He was crouched near the side of the house, fiddling with something. My brain was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I call the police? My parents? I grabbed my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. Before I could dial, Max lunged at the door again, slamming his paws against the glass so hard I thought it might shatter. The man looked up, startled by the noise. That's when I noticed he had something shiny in his hand. It looked like a knife. My stomach dropped. He stood there for a second, staring at the door, and I swear I could feel his frustration through the glass. He muttered something again, then took a step toward the back door. Max was relentless, barking and snarling, his teeth bared. It was like he knew this guy wasn't just some random stranger but a genuine threat. I realized then that Max wasn't just trying to scare him off, he was protecting me. I backed away from the window, trying to think. My phone was still in my hand, but instead of calling anyone, I instinctively dialed 911. I remember whispering to the operator, barely able to hear my own voice over Max's barking. I told them someone was trying to get into the house and gave them my address as quickly as I could. They assured me that help was on the way, but those few minutes felt like hours. Meanwhile, the guy had started trying the back door handle. I could see it rattling from where I was crouched in the hallway, just out of sight. Max was pressed up against the glass, barking so loudly it almost drowned out the sound of my own pounding heart. Then, out of nowhere, the guy slammed something against the glass door, hard. The noise was deafening, and I was sure the glass was going to break. Max didn't flinch, though. If anything, he got louder, throwing himself at the door with all his weight. The man hesitated, stepping back as if he wasn't expecting that kind of resistance. That's when I saw the red and blue lights reflecting off the windows. The police had arrived. The guy bolted, hopping the fence and disappearing into the neighbor's yard before the officers could catch him. Max kept barking until one of the cops knocked on the front door and I let them in. After the police arrived, everything felt like a blur. I was shaking so hard I could barely get the words out to explain what had happened. Max stayed glued to my side, his ears perked up and his body still tense, like he was ready to charge if the guy came back. One of the officers walked through the backyard while the other stayed with me, asking for a description of the man. I told them everything I could remember. The fake uniform, the weird badge, the knife. When I mentioned the knife, the officer's face changed. He said there had been reports of a dangerous criminal in the area posing as a utility worker to get into people's homes. My blood ran cold. They stayed for a while, checking the perimeter and asking the neighbors if they'd seen anything. No one had, and the guy was long gone. Before they left, one of the officers crouched down to pet Max, calling him a hero. I hugged Max so tightly I could feel his heart pounding against mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that man's face, the way he looked at the house like it was something he was entitled to. If it hadn't been for Max, I don't know what would have happened. Even now, years later, I can't leave the house without double-checking every lock, and Max, well, let's just say he's never gone a day without getting his favorite treats. Chased in the woods. I've always loved longboarding at night. There's something calming about the cool air and the emptiness of the roads. My buddy Jake and I had been hitting up new trails for weeks, but that night we decided to go further out, somewhere rural and untouched. We found this old trail online, tucked deep in the woods, about an hour outside the city. It was supposed to be steep and winding, perfect for a rush. We didn't think much of the fact it was already past 10 p.m. when we arrived. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional rustle in the bushes. Our headlights lit up the narrow path ahead, but everything beyond that was pitch black. Honestly, I wasn't worried, at least not yet. We were about 20 minutes in, flying down the trail, when I started getting this uneasy feeling. The woods felt wrong, like it was watching us. I shrugged it off as paranoia until Jake stopped suddenly ahead of me. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. I listened, and that's when I heard it too, a faint rumbling like an engine. At first, I thought maybe it was an ATV or a dirt bike, but the sound wasn't constant. It would roar to life, then stop abruptly, as if someone was cutting it off on purpose. We stood there for a minute, our boards at our feet, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. Jake and I exchanged a glance, and without saying a word, we decided to keep moving. The trail curved sharply downhill, and we picked up speed, our headlights bouncing off the dirt and trees. But the engine noise got louder, closer. It wasn't a dirt bike. There were at least 2 engines now, and they weren't on the trail. They were weaving through the woods, snapping branches and crushing undergrowth as they moved parallel to us. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by, they were following us. We pushed harder, adrenaline kicking in. The trail was uneven, and I almost lost my balance more than once. Jake yelled something, but I couldn't hear him over the roaring engines. Then, out of nowhere, the headlights of a truck burst onto the trail ahead, blinding us. The vehicle skidded to a stop, blocking our path. Jake stopped just in time, but I veered off into the bushes, landing hard on the ground. I scrambled to my feet as another engine roared up behind us. It was like they'd planned it, cutting off every escape. My chest tightened with panic as the truck door slammed open, and a tall guy in a baseball cap stepped out, holding something long in his hand, probably a pipe or a bat. "Get back here!" the guy shouted, his voice booming through the trees. I didn't even stop to think. I just ran, leaving my board behind. Jake was right behind me, his flashlight swinging wildly as we bolted off the trail and into the woods. The branches scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't care. My only focus was putting as much distance as possible between us and them. Behind us, the truck's engine roared to life again, and the second vehicle, probably another truck or an ATV, was circling around to cut us off. I could barely see where I was going, my legs burning as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me to the side just as headlights swept through the trees, barely missing us. We hit the ground hard, ducking behind a fallen log as the truck rolled past. I could hear them yelling to each other, their voices angry and slurred. One of them laughed, a low, chilling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "They can't be far," one of them called out. Jake pressed his hand over my mouth to muffle my breathing as we lay there, hearts pounding in unison. We stayed crouched behind the log, barely daring to breathe. The truck idled just a few yards away, its headlights scanning the trees like spotlights. Every time the light passed over us, my heart stopped. I could hear boots crunching on the ground, someone pacing near the truck. "They're in here somewhere," one of them muttered. It was the tone of someone who wasn't planning to just scare us. He sounded angry, like we'd done something to piss him off. I squeezed Jake's arm, silently pleading for him to stay still, but he was already ahead of me, nodding toward a gap in the trees behind us. The second the truck rolled a little further down the trail, we made our move. We didn't sprint this time. We crept, moving as quietly as we could through the underbrush. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to keep going. Just as we thought we'd gotten far enough away, a flashlight beam swept through the woods, catching Jake's backpack. "There!" someone yelled. My blood ran cold as the chase started again. This time, we didn't bother trying to be quiet. We just ran, crashing through the bushes like wild animals, the sound of footsteps and shouting close behind. We burst out onto a gravel road, and for a split second, I thought we'd found a way out. But then I saw the second truck, its headlights blinding and the engine roaring as it sped toward us. Jake grabbed my arm, yanking me off the road just in time. The truck skidded to a stop where we'd been, its tires kicking up a spray of rocks. "You little punks think you can run," a voice bellowed. My ears rang as I stumbled, my foot catching on something, sending me sprawling onto the ground. Jake was already pulling me back up, his face pale and panicked. We ran into a dense part of the woods, the trees so thick they blocked out most of the moonlight. My chest burned with every breath, and my headlamp flickered, barely illuminating the ground in front of me. Behind us, I could hear them crashing through the brush, their shouts louder, angrier. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Jake and I froze, panting, waiting for something, anything. All we could hear was the distant hum of an engine, idling somewhere in the dark. The silence was worse than the shouting. It felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what came next. We stayed frozen, listening to the eerie quiet, but my gut told me this wasn't over. Then, from somewhere to our left, came the crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was stalking us. Jake's flashlight flickered as he pointed it toward the sound, his hand shaking so badly the beam jittered across the trees. I could barely see, but I could hear the snap of a twig, closer this time. Whoever it was, they were trying to scare us, and it was working. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I swear my legs were ready to give out. Suddenly, there was a deafening roar, the engine from the truck revving to life again. The headlights exploded through the trees, lighting up the woods around us like a spotlight. Jake screamed, yanking me down as the truck barreled toward us. It was so close I could feel the heat of the engine and the gravel spraying up from its tires. I hit the ground hard, rolling into a shallow ditch. When I looked up, the truck was gone, disappearing down the trail like a phantom. The woods were quiet again, except for Jake's ragged breathing next to me. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered, but I didn't have an answer. We stayed in that ditch for what felt like hours, even though it was probably just minutes. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the truck's engine, had me on edge. I kept expecting them to come back, to find us and finish whatever they'd started. Jake nudged me, pointing toward a faint orange glow in the distance. "Fire," he mouthed. I nodded, but my stomach churned. If they'd started a fire, it wasn't for warmth. They were trying to flush us out. We crawled along the ditch, keeping low and moving away from the glow. My knees and palms were scraped raw, but I didn't care. Survival was all that mattered now. When we reached a small clearing, Jake pulled out his phone. His hands trembled so badly that it took him 3 tries to unlock it, only to groan in frustration when he saw we had no signal. "Figures," he muttered under his breath. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable crackle of a radio. My blood ran cold as a voice crackled through, distorted but clear enough. "They're close. Keep looking." That was the moment I realized we weren't just dealing with some random locals trying to scare us. They were coordinated. Who even uses radios anymore? Jake and I exchanged a look, pure terror written all over his face. We had to move fast. Staying put wasn't an option. The crackling radio faded, but we could still hear footsteps somewhere behind us, heavier now, like they were closing in. I motioned for Jake to follow, and we took off again, deeper into the woods. I didn't care if we got lost. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between us and them. The trees started thinning out, and soon we stumbled onto another trail, this one wider and packed with gravel. For a split second, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was a service road. Maybe we'd run into someone who could help. But then Jake stopped dead in his tracks, grabbing my arm so hard it hurt. I followed his gaze and froze. At the far end of the trail, silhouetted against the moonlight, were 2 figures standing perfectly still. They didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there, like they were waiting. My heart was in my throat as one of them raised their arm, and the beam of a flashlight hit us dead on. The flashlight beam blinded me, and for a moment, all I could do was shield my eyes. "Run," Jake hissed, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. The figures started walking toward us, slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. Their silence was the worst part. No shouting, no threats, just the crunch of their boots on gravel. Finally, my body kicked into gear, and we bolted back into the woods. The underbrush was thicker here, clawing at our clothes and skin as we crashed through it. Behind us, I could hear them following, moving faster now. My lungs burned, and every breath felt like it might be my last. Jake tripped on a root and went down hard, letting out a pained grunt. I stopped to help him up, but before I could, a flashlight beam hit us again, illuminating Jake's face like a spotlight. "Gotcha," a voice growled, low and guttural. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Jake's arm, dragging him to his feet. We stumbled forward, barely making it out of the beam's reach before the sound of footsteps and snapping branches grew deafening. We ran until my legs felt like they'd give out, the shouts and footsteps fading behind us. Finally, we found ourselves at the edge of a steep drop-off, a rocky embankment leading down to a shallow stream. There was no time to think. "Jump!" Jake yelled, already scrambling down. I followed, sliding on my back as loose rocks tore at my clothes and skin. The noise we made must have been loud enough to give us away, but at that point, I didn't care. We hit the bottom hard, water soaking my shoes as we splashed through the stream. When we reached the other side, we crouched in the tall grass, gasping for air. The woods above us were quiet again, eerily so. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, engines, voices, but there was nothing. Jake looked at me, his face pale and smeared with dirt. "Do you think they're gone?" he whispered. Before I could answer, a beam of light swept across the top of the embankment, then stopped, pointed right at us. My stomach dropped as I realized they hadn't given up. They'd been watching the whole time. Jake didn't wait for me to react. He grabbed my arm, and we bolted again, sprinting along the stream. My legs felt like lead, but fear kept me moving. The flashlight beam wavered as they scrambled down the embankment behind us, their boots crunching on rocks and splashing into the water. They were close, too close. The stream curved sharply, and we followed it, hoping it would lead to something. A road, a house, anything. But all it did was take us deeper into the woods. Then, just as the beam of the flashlight caught up to us, the sound of the truck engine roared to life again. It wasn't on the trail, it was right above us, somehow following along on higher ground. The rumble drowned out everything else, making it impossible to think. Jake shouted something, but I couldn't hear him. The engine revved louder, then cut out abruptly. And just like that, everything stopped. The lights, the sounds, the voices. We stood there, panting, drenched in sweat and water, waiting for the next move. But nothing came. The woods were dead silent, as if we'd been dropped into a vacuum. We waited there for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sign that they were still coming. My ears were straining so hard that every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made me flinch. But the woods stayed silent. Jake was the first to move, tugging at my sleeve and motioning for us to keep going. I didn't argue, I just followed him, one foot in front of the other, my entire body on edge. We found another trail, this one narrower and overgrown, but we didn't care. All that mattered was getting as far away as possible. When we finally saw the faint outline of a road through the trees, I almost cried from relief. The pavement was cracked and empty, but it felt like safety after everything we'd just been through. We started walking, sticking close to the edge in case they came back. But they never did. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted. I still think about it, though, how they seemed to know the woods so well, like they'd done this before. Jake and I haven't been back out to any trails since that night. Honestly, I don't think we ever will. The Crying Recorder. I'll never forget that day. It was late afternoon, right before dusk, when the woods behind my grandparents' house seemed both inviting and ominous. I was about 8 years old, still in that phase where curiosity trumped fear, and I loved wandering into those trees, pretending to be an explorer. That day, though, something was different. As I stepped deeper into the woods, I heard it, a faint, muffled crying. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a wounded one. But as I moved closer, the sound became unmistakably human, soft and trembling, like someone was sobbing quietly just out of sight. I remember feeling this strange mix of excitement and dread. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help? The rational part of me thought to run back to the house, but I was 8. I wasn't exactly known for my rational decisions. The sound seemed to be coming from a cluster of trees just ahead, where the sunlight barely filtered through. My feet crunched on the dried leaves as I approached, and the crying abruptly stopped. That's when I froze. For a moment, the silence was deafening. And then I saw it, a small, battered tape recorder lying in the dirt, partially hidden under some leaves. It looked old, like something from my dad's childhood, with buttons scratched and scuffed from use. I bent down to pick up the tape recorder, feeling an odd chill creep up my arms despite the warm evening air. My fingers hovered over it for a moment, and I noticed tiny, almost childlike fingerprints smudged on its dusty surface. Without thinking, I pressed the play button. At first, There was static, the kind that made my skin crawl, but then the crying started again. It was the same sound I had heard earlier. Soft, shaky, and undeniably human. But what really froze me was how close it sounded, as if the person was standing right next to me. I whipped my head around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there, just the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I wanted to drop the recorder and run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. That's when I noticed something that sent a jolt of terror through me. On the tape recorder, the record button was pressed down, like it was actively recording, right now. My mind raced. How could it be recording if the crying was already playing? My hands shook as I hit the stop button, but instead of silencing the crying, it grew louder, this time coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I stood there, clutching the tape recorder, unable to decide what to do next. The crying was no longer a recording. It was real, echoing through the trees, bouncing off the trunks in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. It sounded closer now, almost like it was circling me. My chest felt tight, and I could barely breathe. I finally managed to drop the recorder, and it hit the ground with a dull thud. The crying stopped instantly, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence that made the woods feel like they were holding their breath. That's when I saw it. Between two trees, maybe 30 feet ahead, a shadow shifted. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, but then it moved again, stepping forward. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated in a way that didn't look right, like they'd been stretched out of proportion. Its face was obscured, but I could see faint glowing eyes fixed directly on me. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of fear before or since. It wasn't just being scared, it was this primal, gut-wrenching certainty that I needed to run or I wouldn't make it out. I don't even remember making the decision to run. It just happened. 1 second, I was frozen, staring at that thing, and the next, I was sprinting through the trees as fast as my legs would carry me. The branches clawed at my face and arms, and my feet slipped on the damp ground, but I didn't stop. I could hear something behind me, heavy, uneven footsteps, like it was dragging one of its legs. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. Every step sounded closer, and I felt like it was gaining on me no matter how hard I pushed myself. At some point, I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of me. I scrambled to get up, but when I glanced back, I saw it standing just a few feet away. I couldn't see its face clearly, but those glowing eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. It raised one of its impossibly long arms, and for a split second, I thought it was reaching for me. Then it stopped, tilted its head slightly, and made the most horrifying sound I've ever heard. It mimicked the crying from before, perfectly. The exact same tone, pitch, everything. My brain couldn't process it. It wasn't just imitating the crying. It was mocking it. That sound jolted me into motion again. I scrambled to my feet, my knees wobbling so badly I almost fell over. I didn't care where I was running anymore. I just needed to get away. My chest burned, and tears blurred my vision, but I kept going, barely dodging trees as I stumbled through the thick underbrush. The footsteps behind me grew fainter, but I could still hear the crying echoing around me, as if it was coming from everywhere at once. I couldn't tell if it was following me or if my mind was just playing tricks, but it felt like it was inside my head, growing louder with every step. Eventually, I saw a break in the trees and burst out into the field behind my grandparents' house. The sun had almost set, and the sky was this deep orange, but it felt like I'd stepped into a different world entirely. I glanced back, half expecting to see it standing at the edge of the woods, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and silence. My grandparents' house wasn't far now, and I bolted toward it, feeling like the thing could appear behind me at any second. When I finally reached the porch, I slammed the door behind me and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. My grandparents found me on the floor, shaking and covered in dirt. I tried to tell them what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. Between my gasps and tears, I must have sounded like a babbling mess. They thought I'd just gotten spooked by something in the woods, a deer or a stray dog, maybe. My grandpa even laughed it off, saying, "That's why we tell you to stay close to the house." I didn't argue. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen something that wasn't human, something that mocked the sound of crying like it was some kind of twisted game? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house making me jump. At some point, I convinced myself it was over. Whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, was still out there in the woods, far away from me now. But just as I started to drift off, I heard it. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. The crying. It was coming from the edge of the woods, right where the trees met the field. I stayed frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, until the sound finally faded. To this day, I don't know what I saw or why it was out there, but I've never gone near those woods again. And sometimes, even now, I swear I can hear that crying when I close my eyes. The strange meadow tent. It was supposed to be one of those aimless, relaxing days. My buddy Mark and I had decided to take his truck and explore some back roads out in the middle of nowhere. The kind of roads where the pavement turns to gravel, and then to dirt, and finally to nothing but overgrown grass and trees crowding in on either side. We weren't looking for anything in particular, just killing time and enjoying the isolation. It was around 3 p.m. when we stumbled upon this random clearing. Mark spotted it first, a flat, open patch of meadow in the middle of the woods. It looked almost too perfect, like something out of a postcard. But what really caught our attention was this bright orange picnic table right in the center of it. Who drags a neon orange table into a place like this? The closer we got, the weirder it became. Near the table was a tent, but it wasn't like your typical camping setup. This thing was old, filthy, and sagging in the middle, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The tent flap was open, and inside, we saw piles of women's clothing, dresses, jackets, shoes, all just thrown in there like trash. No bags, no camping gear, no sign that anyone had actually slept in it. Just clothes, and all of them looked old and kind of out of place, like they belonged to different decades. Mark and I exchanged a look. Something about it made my stomach knot up, but at the same time, curiosity was clawing at me. Against my better judgment, we stepped out of the truck to get a closer look. As we walked toward the tent, the air felt heavy. I don't know how else to explain it. The meadow had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Even Mark, who's usually the let's poke the creepy thing with a stick type, seemed uneasy. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he expected someone to jump out of the woods. I leaned into the tent to get a better look, and that's when I noticed the clothes weren't just thrown in haphazardly. They were damp, almost like they'd been left out in the rain, but the ground beneath the tent was dry. Some of the dresses had weird stains on them, rusty brown blotches, and one of the jackets had these deep scratches down the back, like it had been dragged through brambles or something worse. I didn't say anything, but my skin was crawling. The whole thing felt wrong, like we were intruding on something we shouldn't have. Then, out of nowhere, Mark whispered, "Do you hear that?" I froze and strained my ears, but at first, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then I caught it, a faint rustling, coming from the woods behind the tent. It wasn't the sound of an animal, though. It was deliberate, slow, like someone trying to move quietly. Mark and I stood there like idiots, staring at each other, both too freaked out to say anything. The rustling got louder, closer. That was enough for me. "We should go," I muttered, already backing toward the truck. Mark nodded, and we started walking quickly, trying not to look like we were panicking. But just as we reached the truck, something else caught my eye. A car, a black sedan, parked at the edge of the clearing. It hadn't been there when we arrived. Mark and I froze, staring at the car. It was just sitting there, engine off, windows tinted so dark we couldn't see inside. There was no way it had pulled up without us hearing it, but there it was, like it had materialized out of thin air. I whispered to Mark, "You locked the truck, right?" He didn't answer. He was already unlocking his door, fumbling with the keys as his eyes stayed glued to the sedan. That's when the driver's side door of the car opened. Slowly, a man stepped out, tall and thin, dressed in a black hoodie and jeans. His face was hidden under the hood, but I could feel his eyes on us. Then the passenger door opened, and another guy got out. Same hoodie, same jeans. Neither of them said a word. They just stood there, watching us. I didn't wait to see what they were planning. I yanked open the passenger door and scrambled into the truck, slamming it shut just as Mark started the engine. The sound broke the silence like a gunshot, and that's when the men started walking toward us. Not running, just this slow, deliberate walk, like they knew we had nowhere to go. "Go, go, go," I yelled, but Mark was already flooring it. The truck lurched forward, and for a second, I thought we were clear. Then I looked in the side mirror. The sedan was right behind us. Its headlights snapped on, blindingly bright, and it roared to life like it had been waiting for this moment. Mark swerved onto the dirt path we'd come from, tires kicking up gravel as the car gained on us, the engine growling louder with every second. The path was narrow and uneven, barely wide enough for the truck, and every bump made the whole vehicle shake like it was about to fall apart. Mark was gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles were white, and I could see sweat dripping down his face. "They're getting closer," I shouted, watching as the sedan closed the gap in the rear-view mirror. It didn't seem to care about the rough terrain. It was moving like it was on a smooth highway. Worse, it didn't just feel like they were chasing us. It felt like they were toying with us. Every time we sped up, they'd hang back just enough to let us think we had a chance, only to surge forward again. Then the horn blared. A single, deafening honk that cut through the air like a scream. I jumped so hard I nearly hit my head on the roof. Mark swerved, almost losing control, as the sedan sped up and got so close I could see its front grille in the mirror. I swear, it was like the car was alive. Its headlights flashed once, twice, then stayed on, brighter than they should have been, like stadium lights, practically burning through the cab of the truck. The noise was overwhelming. Our tires on the gravel, the roar of the engine, and that damn horn blaring again and again. My chest was tight, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the edge of my seat. "We can't outrun them," Mark yelled, his voice cracking. He was right. The truck was struggling to keep speed, and the sedan just kept coming. We hit a sharp curve, and Mark barely managed to keep the truck on the path. The sedan was still right behind us, its headlights flooding the cab with this awful, blinding white light. My head was spinning, and all I could think was that we were going to crash, or worse, whatever was in that car was going to catch us. Then, as we rounded the bend, the path opened up into another clearing. It wasn't as neat as the meadow with the orange table, more like a rough patch of dirt surrounded by dense trees. Mark didn't slow down, but the sedan did. I glanced back and saw it stop just at the edge of the clearing, its headlights dimming as if it was watching us. "What the hell are they doing?" I muttered, my voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He slammed on the brakes, skidding the truck to a stop in the middle of the clearing. The air felt thick again, almost suffocating, like back at the tent. "We can't just sit here," I shouted, but before I could say anything else, the truck's engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," Mark muttered, turning the key again and again, but it was no use. The truck was dead. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Typical. I looked back at the sedan. It was still sitting there, just beyond the clearing, its engine idling softly. And then, the headlights went out. We couldn't see a thing except the faint silhouette of the car against the trees. The quiet was unbearable, broken only by the sound of Mark's panicked breathing and the creak of the truck's cooling engine. We sat there, frozen, staring at the dark outline of the sedan. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, but where would we go? The woods were dense, and the path was barely visible even in daylight. Mark whispered, "What do they want?" But I didn't have an answer. My eyes stayed locked on the car, half expecting the doors to swing open and those two men to step out again. But they didn't. Instead, the car started to move, silently, almost gliding, as it backed into the tree line. 1 second, it was there, and the next, it had disappeared into the darkness. The clearing felt even heavier now, like something was pressing down on us. Mark turned the key one more time, and by some miracle, the truck roared back to life. "Let's go," he said, his voice shaking, and this time, I didn't argue. We sped out of there, not caring about the potholes or the branches scraping against the sides of the truck. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I kept looking out the back window, expecting to see the sedan's headlights flaring up behind us again, but the path stayed empty. After what felt like an eternity, we hit paved road, and the sense of relief was almost overwhelming. But it didn't last long. As Mark turned onto the main highway, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A smear of orange. I twisted around, and there it was, a single piece of that picnic table, lying right in the middle of the road. "You saw that, right?" I asked, but Mark didn't answer. He just kept driving faster and faster, until the meadow, the tent, and whatever the hell had happened out there were miles behind us. We didn't talk much on the way back. Mark's hand stayed tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched like he was trying to hold it together. I kept replaying everything in my head, the orange table, the clothes, those men, the way the sedan had just vanished. None of it made sense, and the more I thought about it, the more it felt like trying to grab smoke. By the time we got back to town, it was almost dark. Mark dropped me off at my place, and I could tell he was as shaken as I was. "You gonna be okay?" I asked, but he just nodded and mumbled something about needing to clear his head. As he pulled away, I stood there on my porch, watching the taillights of his truck disappear into the distance. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that tent, the stains on the clothes, or the headlights of the sedan bearing down on us. At some point, I got up and checked all the locks on my doors and windows, something I'd never done before. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that we were being watched out there, like we'd stumbled into something we were never meant to see. Mark won't talk about it anymore. Every time I bring it up, he changes the subject or tells me to drop it. I've stopped asking. But sometimes, when I'm out driving late at night, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again, or maybe that flash of orange. I don't know what we ran into out there, but whatever it was, I hope to God we never find it again.